Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The city of Mainz in those years was a place where fortunes rose and fell with the seasons, where a man's reputation could be worth more than his coin, and where the difference between comfort and ruin often came down to a single poor decision. Margarethe's father, Heinrich, had learned this lesson too late, not all at once, but gradually, through a series of small mistakes that accumulated like dust on an untended shelf. He was a cloth merchant, which meant he occupied a middle position in the city's hierarchy, above the laborers and servants, below the great trading houses that dealt in spices and silks. Respected enough to walk through the market district without lowering his eyes, yet perpetually anxious about whether his stock would sell before the season changed and prices shifted against him. Heinrich was a gentleman, which was both his virtue and his failing. He treated his customers fairly, measuring cloth accurately when others shaved the edge of their measures, offering honest counsel about quality when he might have deceived. He was known for this honesty, and it earned him a certain kind of loyalty, the loyalty of people who could not afford to be cheated and appreciated dealing with someone they could trust. Yet loyalty alone does not sustain a business. A man must also have the shrewdness to recognize when a partner is draining him, the ruthlessness to refuse a friend's request for credit when credit cannot be safely given, the calculation to anticipate which fabrics will be fashionable and which will gather dust in his storeroom. Margarethe was 7 years old when she first began to notice these patterns, though she could not have named them as such. What she noticed was simpler: the way her father's face changed when certain people entered his shop, a particular quality of tension in his voice when he spoke to them. She noticed the ledger he kept hidden in his private room, the one he thought no one knew about, and the way he would study it in the evenings with an expression that suggested he was reading bad news written in his own hand. She noticed the visits from other merchants, conversations conducted in low voices, the occasional gift of wine or cloth given away to maintain a relationship that seemed, to her young mind, already frayed beyond repair. Her mother had died when Margarethe was an infant, a fever that came on suddenly and took her away before the physicians could determine what ailed her. Margarethe had no memory of her, only the knowledge that she had existed, derived from fragments of conversation and the small objects her father kept. A linen cap embroidered with initials, a wooden comb with fine teeth, a ring of tarnished silver. Her brother Wilhelm was 12 years older and had left the household 5 years before Margarethe was born, apprenticed to a master printer in Strasbourg. He sent occasional letters written in careful script, describing his progress and promising to visit someday, a promise that never quite materialized. This absence meant that Margarethe grew up in a household of adult men, her father and the servants who helped him, and learned early to observe rather than to speak, to understand the world through watching. The cloth trade in Mainz depended on relationships with the great trading companies and with the weavers and dyers who produced the goods. It was an intricate web, and Heinrich occupied an uncertain position within it. He was not wealthy enough to buy large quantities of the best fabrics directly, nor poor enough to be ignored by the major suppliers. Instead, he occupied a middle ground, purchasing from middlemen, selling to minor nobility, and wealthy merchants' wives and the families of successful craftspeople. This meant he was dependent on credit, on the goodwill of suppliers who would allow him to purchase on account, expecting payment when his goods sold. It was a system that functioned only as long as trust remained intact. Trust began to fray when Heinrich accepted credit from a trader named Cornelius, a man from the Low Countries who came to Mainz with promises of exceptional quality and exceptional prices. Cornelius was charming and persuasive. He dressed well, spoke multiple languages, and had letters of introduction from respected merchants in other cities. He offered Heinrich an opportunity to purchase a large quantity of fine Flemish cloth at a price that undercut the usual suppliers. If Heinrich could sell this cloth quickly, he could make a profit that would secure his position and allow him to expand. The temptation was substantial. The risk was proportional. What Heinrich did not know, or perhaps did not wish to acknowledge, was that Cornelius's letters of introduction were fraudulent, that he had attempted similar schemes in Bruges and Antwerp, and that the cloth he was selling, while genuine, had been acquired through means that involved creditors in other cities who would eventually come looking for payment. When Cornelius disappeared from Mainz 6 months later, the debt remained. The suppliers whose payment had been delayed began to demand settlement. The merchants to whom Heinrich had extended credit to purchase the Flemish cloth became angry when they learned the fabric was potentially subject to seizure. The careful network of relationships that Heinrich had spent years building began to unravel. Margarethe was 11 years old when her father's illness began. It manifested as a lingering cough, the kind that comes in autumn and normally passes with winter. But it did not pass. It deepened. He grew thinner. The color drained from his face. He spent more time in his private room, less time in the shop. The servants began to whisper. Customers noticed and stopped coming as frequently. The shop, which had been the center of her father's identity and his economic survival, became a place he could barely manage. During these months, Margarethe took on responsibilities that would have been unusual for a girl her age. She began to assist in the shop, learning to measure cloth, to assess quality by feel and appearance, to speak to customers with courtesy and precision. She discovered that she had an aptitude for it, a natural ability to gauge what people wanted and to present goods in a way that encouraged purchase. She also discovered, through listening and observing, the precariousness of her family's position. She heard her father's creditors arrive, their voices growing more insistent as weeks passed. She saw letters arrive, bearing seals she did not recognize, demanding payment. She understood, in the wordless way that children understand such things, that her family's comfortable circumstances, the house, the servants, the certainty of her place in the world, were not permanent, not guaranteed, but held on sufferance. Her father called her to his bedside one evening near the end of his life. It was winter, Snow had fallen and covered the streets outside in white. The room was cold despite the small fire burning in the brazier. He lay beneath several woolen blankets, his breathing shallow and irregular. He took her hand. His own was thin, the skin papery, the bones prominent beneath the surface. "You have your mother's eyes," he said. "Did I ever tell you that?" She shook her head. She had been very young when he last spoke of her mother, and the detail had not stuck. "She was clever, more clever than I am. She would have managed things better." He paused, gathering breath. "I have made mistakes, Margarethe. Poor choices. You have seen them, I think. You watch people carefully. You notice things." "Father," she began, but he squeezed her hand gently. "Listen. After I am gone, people will come to offer you things. Offers of marriage, offers of service in a household, offers to settle the debts if you agree to this or that arrangement. You must be very careful. Not everyone who smiles is being kind. Not everyone who makes a promise intends to keep it. I learned this too late. Do not make my mistake. Watch. Listen. Trust slowly. And remember that a person's true nature often shows in small moments, when they think no one is paying attention, when they believe nothing depends on their behavior." He died 3 days later, on a morning when frost covered the inside of the windows. He was 52 years old. Margarethe was 18. The aftermath was swift and, in its way, merciful. His debts were substantial but not ruinous. The house was seized by creditors. The goods in the shop were liquidated to pay portions of what he owed. What remained, a small amount of coin carefully hidden that he had instructed Margarethe to find after his death, was enough to allow her to survive for a time, if she lived carefully. She also inherited something less tangible, his reputation for honesty and his name, which still carried weight among certain older merchants who had respected him. And she inherited his rooms in the charitable house maintained by the Weavers' Guild, a small space where she could live affordably and with protection. In the weeks following his death, Margarethe moved through the city like someone navigating a landscape that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. The streets were familiar, but felt different now. She was no longer the daughter of a merchant. She was a young woman alone, without family or male protection, which in that world was a precarious state. She took work as a servant in the household of a wealthy merchant, helping to manage the women's quarters. She was competent and discreet, and her employer seemed satisfied with her work. Yet she felt the precariousness in her bones, the knowledge that a single accusation, a single moment of displeasure, could leave her without shelter or income. It was during this time that she met an older woman named Ursula. Ursula had been a servant like her, and then a wife, and then a widow. She lived in one of the rooms in the Weavers' Guild house and made a modest living by brewing small beer and selling it to the apprentices and journeymen who lived in the district. She was perhaps 60 years old, sturdy, with hands that bore the calluses of decades of work. She had seen much and spoke little, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. Margarethe encountered her often in the shared courtyard of the guild house. One evening, sitting on a stone bench while Ursula hung wet cloth to dry, Margarethe asked her how she had managed, after her husband died, to support herself. Ursula was quiet for a long moment. "I did what I could," she finally said. "I worked where work was available. Then my husband died, and left me a small space and a small sum. I thought about what I knew. I knew how to brew beer. I knew how to keep accounts. I knew people, men mostly, who came through the guild house. I opened a small tavern, very modest at first. It grew. It is enough. I am not rich, but I am not dependent on anyone's goodwill. That matters more than I can tell you. A tavern, Margarethe said, and Ursula looked at her with eyes that suggested she was assessing something. Why? Are you thinking of such a thing? Margarethe was not in that moment, but the seed was planted. Over the following months, as she continued her work in the merchant's household and observed the city's complex geography of commerce and survival, she began to consider the possibility. A tavern was not a respectable business for a woman, or rather, it was respectable only if conducted with absolute propriety and extraordinary caution. But it was an independent business. It did not require large capital. It could be operated with intelligence and careful attention to detail. And it might be a way to carve out a position in the world that did not require her to accept the charity or control of others. When she had saved enough money, she approached Ursula and asked for advice. Ursula spent several evenings with her, explaining how such an establishment functioned, what costs were involved, what permits must be obtained, what pitfalls existed. She introduced her to other women who ran small establishments in the city. One ran a wine shop, another served meals to laborers, a third managed a more substantial tavern in the wealthier district. Each had found a way to operate within the constraints that existed for women while maintaining a degree of independence. Margarethe began to scout locations. The city's merchant quarter was too expensive and too competitive. The wealthy district was closed to her by unwritten but rigid rules about who could operate there. But the edge of the market district, where craftspeople lived and worked, the carpenters, the masons, the metal workers, the weavers, that was a place where a modest establishment might take root. She found a building that had been used for storage, a two-story structure with a large room on the ground floor and smaller rooms above. The price was affordable. The permit could be obtained through connections she had maintained from her father's time. She was 20 years old when she opened her tavern. She had no husband to give her legitimacy or to provide capital. She had no family to support her or to intercede on her behalf with the city authorities. What she had was her father's reputation for honesty, her own intelligence, a capacity for hard work, and the lessons learned from watching both his failures and the strategies of older women who had managed to survive. The tavern did not thrive immediately. It was small and plain, with a bar of dark wood and tables of simple construction. She served small beer which she brewed herself in a room behind the main space, following recipes that Ursula had shared. She offered simple food, bread, cheese, broths, occasionally meat when she could afford it. She kept her measures honest, her prices fair, her establishment clean. She was there from dawn until late evening, working alone except for a single young servant girl who helped her during busy hours. What she created was not a place of luxury or excitement. It was a place of quiet reliability, of fair dealing, of a kind of peace. Craftspeople came there because the beer was good and the prices honest. They came because she did not pry into their affairs, but listened when they wished to talk. They came because she was competent and unflappable, and because somehow being in her establishment made the world feel slightly more manageable. She did not yet know that this modest tavern, this small corner of the city, would become the center around which her life would eventually revolve, or that the skills she was developing, the ability to read people, to keep secrets, to navigate between different social worlds, would eventually entangle her in a mystery far deeper and more dangerous than she could have imagined. She knew only that she had carved out a space that was hers, and that this was enough. This was, perhaps, everything. 7 years had passed since Margarethe opened her tavern, and in that time, the small establishment on the edge of the market district had become something more solid than she had dared to hope. The building itself had changed. The walls, once bare and austere, had been whitewashed and bore the soft patina of years of work and care. The tables had been replaced with better wood, though still plain. A window on the street side had been enlarged, letting in more light and allowing passers-by to see inside, to recognize the order and cleanliness of the space. The cellar had been expanded and reinforced, providing cool storage for beer and wine through the warm months. The kitchen, originally a cramped room behind the bar, had been reorganized and equipped with better tools. These improvements had been made gradually, each one funded by small surpluses saved and carefully invested back into the business. Margarethe herself had changed as well, though the change was subtle, less visible than the physical transformations of her establishment, but no less real. She was now 27 years old, in the fullness of her strength and capability. Her face, which had been soft in youth, had developed sharper planes and angles, marked by years of early rising and intense focus. Her hands bore the marks of her work, small burns from the brewing fire, calluses on her palms and fingers, the permanent stain of work dyes beneath her nails. She moved through her tavern with the economy of motion that comes from having performed the same tasks thousands of times. She could assess a customer's mood from the angle of his shoulders as he entered. She could calculate whether to approach him with conversation or leave him in privacy to nurse his drink. The tavern had a rhythm, seasonal and weekly, that Margarethe had learned to read with precision. Market days brought a rush of activity. Merchants and buyers and brokers moving between the stalls outside, some pausing in her establishment for refreshment. Mondays were quieter. The weekend labor had exhausted people and left them with less coin to spend. Thursdays belonged to the craftspeople's guilds, which met in the evenings, and her tavern had become, informally, a place where certain guild business was conducted over beer and conversation. The autumn and early winter brought more customers seeking warmth and shelter. The spring and summer saw the tavern emptier as people dispersed to work outdoors. She had learned to stock accordingly, to prepare her brewing schedule in advance, to understand the margin that allowed her to survive the lean months by relying on the abundance of others. The city itself had become more familiar, its networks and hierarchies more visible. She understood now that Mainz was not a single entity, but multiple entities layered atop one another. The city of the cathedral chapter, which held temporal power alongside the religious authority of the bishop. The city of the merchant guilds, which regulated commerce and controlled access to certain trades. The city of the craft guilds, the carpenters, masons, weavers, metalworkers, which structured labor and created the possibility of a kind of upward mobility through apprenticeship and skill. And beneath all of this, the city of servants, apprentices, laborers, and the poor, who inhabited the alleys and courtyards and whose lives were governed by necessity and the needs of those above them. Margarethe occupied a position at the intersection of these worlds. Her tavern was frequented by craftspeople and their apprentices, by minor merchants, by clerks and scribes who worked for the church or the city authorities, by soldiers quartered in the city, by a few women who worked in various capacities and sought an hour of rest and conversation. This diversity of clientele meant that Margarethe encountered, in compressed form, many of the tensions and conflicts that animated city life. She heard complaints about the price of grain from the poor, about the restrictiveness of guild regulations from ambitious craftspeople, about the corruption of certain church officials from those with grievances against the ecclesiastical authorities. She heard gossip and rumors, business proposals and schemes, confessions and boasts. She heard the texture of daily life in all its specificity, disputes between neighbors over property lines, rumors of infidelity, stories of unexpected fortune or sudden loss, tales of apprentices who had run away or masters who had treated their workers brutally. Through all of this, she maintained a careful neutrality. She did not take sides in disputes. She did not repeat what was told to her in confidence. She did not offer advice unless asked. And when she did offer it, she did so carefully, suggesting possibilities rather than dictating conclusions. This discretion had become her reputation. People trusted her not because she was kind, though she was in her way, but because she was reliable. They knew that what they said in her tavern would not be repeated, would not be used against them, would remain secure in the space she had created. Her days began before dawn. She rose in the small room she occupied on the upper floor of the tavern, in a bed she had purchased second-hand but kept meticulously clean, covered with linens she washed herself. She descended to the kitchen and began the work of the day, checking the stores, planning the food that would be served, assessing what needed to be purchased. Most mornings she went to the market herself, moving between the stalls with a deliberate pace, negotiating prices with the vendors who had come to know her. She understood quality, the ripeness of vegetables, the freshness of bread, the fat content of meat, and she did not overpay for inferior goods, nor did she haggle in a way that created resentment. She built relationships with the market vendors, and this meant that occasionally, when stock was limited, she received preference, or was offered goods at better prices than were available to other buyers. The brewing of beer was the core of her operation. It was skilled work, requiring knowledge that had been passed down through generations of brewers, and that she had learned partly from Ursula and partly through experimentation and careful observation. She understood the importance of water quality, the interaction of grains and temperatures, the timing of fermentation, the precise moment when a batch of beer had reached its optimal state. She kept detailed records of her brewing, the dates, the conditions, the results, so that she could replicate her successes and avoid her failures. The beer she produced was reliable and well regarded. It was not exceptional. She did not have access to the finest grains or the most exotic ingredients, but it was honest beer made with care, and this was enough to build a reputation. The tavern employed, besides Margarethe herself, 2 people. The first was Magda, a girl of 14 who had come to her seeking work 3 years prior. Magda's family had fallen into poverty after her father's accident at a construction site left him unable to work. She had siblings and parents depending on her wages. She was intelligent and eager to learn, and Margarethe had taught her how to serve customers, how to manage the bar, how to clean and organize. Magda was not quick or naturally graceful, but she was reliable and honest, and she had absorbed much of Margarethe's philosophy about fair dealing and discretion. The second was Dietrich, a man in his 60s who had worked as a porter and hauler for much of his life, and whose strength had begun to fail him. His son was a mason, successful enough that he provided his aging father with a small sum each month, but not wealthy enough to fully support him. Dietrich worked in Margarethe's tavern, doing the heavy labor, hauling water, carrying barrels, maintaining the fire, repairing things that broke. In exchange, he received wages, food, and a small room in the basement where he slept. The arrangement suited them both. Margarethe had reliable help without the expense of hiring someone younger and stronger. Dietrich had employment that matched his diminishing physical capacity and allowed him to maintain his independence. It was during these years that Margarethe developed her particular skill at reading people. She observed that certain men drank quickly and grew aggressive. Others sipped slowly and became melancholic. Some customers were eager to talk, others preferred silence. Some lies were transparent, others were constructed with care and required attention to detect. She noticed that people's words often contradicted their gestures, that what someone said they felt did not always match the expression on their face. She learned that desperation had a particular quality, a rigidity in the shoulders, a certain kind of intensity in the eyes. She learned that genuine kindness was rare and different from calculated friendliness, that honor, for some men, was a real thing that governed their behavior, while for others it was merely a word used to justify self-interest. One of her regular customers was a man named Friedrich, a carpenter of perhaps 40 years who came to the tavern 3 or 4 times each week. Friedrich was skilled in his trade. He did fine work in wood, creating furniture and decorative elements for wealthy households and the church. He was also, Margarethe observed, deeply melancholic. He drank moderately, spoke little, and seemed to carry some burden that he did not discuss. She noticed that he always sat in the same corner, that he watched the other customers with an intensity that suggested he was thinking about something deeper than immediate surroundings, that there was a quality of loneliness about him despite the fact that he was often surrounded by other people. Friedrich had a daughter, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, whom he mentioned occasionally. The girl's mother had died years before. Margarethe gathered this from fragments of conversation, and Friedrich had raised her alone, teaching her the skills that a master craftsman might normally teach a son. The daughter had learned woodworking and had become, according to Friedrich's sparse comments, quite talented. Friedrich worried about her future. The guild system did not allow women to become masters in their own right, and her skill, while acknowledged, could not be formally recognized or compensated. She could marry another craftsman, but this would make her dependent on her husband's fortunes. Alternatively, she could work in her father's shop, helping him and taking wages, but this path too had limitations. Margarethe listened to these comments over months and years, never pushing Friedrich to say more, but creating a space where he could speak if he wished. One evening he asked her directly, "If you have a daughter with skills, with intelligence, what do you advise for her future?" Margarethe had been washing glasses at the bar. She set them down carefully and turned to face him. "I would advise her that the world will not hand her what it hands to men," she said. "But there are paths available, if she looks carefully, and does not demand that the world make them obvious. I would advise her that independence, even modest independence, is worth more than security purchased at the cost of submission. And I would advise her that her skills, if she is wise about how she deploys them, are a form of capital that can be invested to create more capital. Friedrich was quiet for a long moment. "And how did you learn this?" he asked. "By watching my father fail," Margarethe said simply, "and by watching what happened after." Another regular customer was a man named Johannes, a clerk who worked for the cathedral chapter. Johannes was perhaps 35 years old, educated, with the careful speech of someone trained in Latin and legal documents. He came to the tavern, usually on Thursdays, often with colleagues, and they discussed matters of church administration and city politics. Johannes had a wife and children, but Margarethe gathered that his marriage was not particularly warm. He seemed to find more genuine companionship among his male colleagues and his visits to the tavern than in his household. He was not a drinker in any excessive sense. He came for the conversation and the temporary relief from domestic obligations. Over time, Johannes began to speak to Margarethe directly, rather than merely ordering drinks from her. He asked her opinion about matters that came up in conversation, what she thought about certain church policies, whether she believed that the city council was acting in the best interest of the populace, whether she thought the craft guilds were too restrictive or appropriately protective of standards. These conversations were unusual. Men of Johannes's education and position did not normally solicit the opinions of tavern keepers about matters of governance. Yet there was something about Margarethe that invited such conversation. Perhaps it was her evident intelligence and thoughtfulness. Perhaps it was the fact that she had no obvious agenda or interest in advancing herself through flattery. Perhaps it was simply that she had created a space where serious conversation felt natural. One evening, Johannes asked her how she had managed to build her business without a husband or family support. Margarethe explained, briefly, the circumstances of her father's death and her own decision to open the tavern. Johannes listened carefully, and then he said something unexpected. "You have more authority than you realize. You have built something. That matters. In this city, most people are trying to maintain what they inherited or what they were given. You created something from nothing. That changes how people respond to you." It was a perceptive observation, and one that Margarethe had not fully articulated to herself. She understood that her tavern was successful, but she had framed this success in practical terms: good beer, honest measures, fair prices, discretion. She had not thought about it in terms of authority or power, concepts she associated with wealth and male position. Yet Johannes was right. She had created something. People came to her establishment by choice. They returned because they found something valuable there. This was in its way a form of power. It was also during these years that Margarethe experienced her first serious failure of judgment, one that would teach her a painful lesson about the gap between kindness and wisdom. A merchant arrived in Mainz, a man named Oswald who dealt in wine and specialized in obtaining rare varieties from regions distant enough that the supply was limited and the prices correspondingly high. Oswald was charming and sophisticated. He dressed well, spoke about wine with genuine passion and knowledge, and treated Margarethe with a respect that was unusual. Most merchants saw her as a business contact, useful, but not someone to be particularly courteous toward. Oswald, by contrast, treated her as if she were someone worth knowing as a person. Over several weeks, Oswald became a regular customer. He brought Margarethe samples of wine, a small glass of something exceptional, something rare, and spoke about its origins and qualities. He asked her about her tavern, about her business, about her life. He was interested in her answers in a way that seemed genuine. He told her stories about his travels, about other cities and other merchants, about opportunities that existed in the wine trade for someone with connections and capital. He suggested that if she were to stock better wines, to offer her customers a wider range, she could attract a different clientele, wealthier, more refined. This could expand her business substantially. The proposal he eventually made was this. He would supply her with wine on credit, allowing her to build her inventory. She would begin to offer his wines, prominently displayed to her customers. As the wines sold and her reputation grew, she would bring in more capital, and eventually she would be able to pay him back while also expanding her own profit margins. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, he suggested. They would be partners in a venture that could benefit them both. Margarethe's caution, which had been carefully developed through her father's example, urged her to decline. But Oswald's charm and the attractiveness of the proposition wore down her resistance. He was kind to her. He treated her as an equal in business discussions. He seemed genuinely invested in her success. She allowed herself to believe that here was someone who was not trying to exploit her, someone with whom genuine partnership was possible. She agreed to his proposal. For the first 6 months, everything proceeded as promised. Oswald brought wine, good wine, at fair prices. Her customers responded well to the expanded offerings. She began to attract a more affluent clientele. Her profits increased. She began to believe that she had made a good decision, that her caution had been excessive, that Oswald was indeed the exception to the general rule of human self-interest and exploitation. Then, gradually, things began to change. Oswald's visits became less frequent. The wines he brought became more expensive, and he began to suggest that her prices were too low to reflect their quality. He suggested that she should raise her prices, and when she resisted, noting that her customers would not pay the higher amounts, he expressed disappointment. He suggested that she was failing to recognize the value of what she was offering. Small disputes arose over accounting, disagreements about what had been paid and what remained owed. Oswald would arrive with documents, supposedly showing that Margarethe owed him more than she believed. The climax came when Oswald arrived one evening with a man she did not recognize, a merchant from another city. Oswald introduced this man as someone interested in investing in Margarethe's business. He suggested that Margarethe sell the tavern to this investor, with Oswald acting as an intermediary and taking a commission. Margarethe realized, in that moment, what had been happening. Oswald had not been building a partnership with her. He had been building a relationship of dependency, gradually increasing her debt to him, and creating a situation in which she would eventually become desperate enough to accept whatever terms he offered. His kindness had been a tool. She refused his proposal, and she demanded an accounting of what she actually owed him. She refused to pay the inflated amounts he claimed. When he threatened legal action, she informed him that she would pursue counterclaims for fraud. She had, it turned out, learned something from her father's experience and from Ursula's advice. She had kept careful records of every transaction, every purchase, every payment. She had documented the arrangement clearly, and she had been scrupulous about what she had actually received and what she had actually paid. Oswald left the city shortly after. He left behind a reputation as someone not to be trusted, someone who had attempted to manipulate a businesswoman into selling her establishment at a loss. The other merchants learned what had happened. The news spread through the commercial networks quickly, and most of them sided with Margarethe. She was local, established, trustworthy. Oswald was an outsider who had attempted a scheme. Yet the experience left a scar. It also created a lesson that was etched into Margarethe's consciousness. Kindness and wisdom are not the same thing. A person can be kind and still be exploitative. A person can be charming and still be dishonest. Caution is not cruelty. Refusing to be manipulated is not a failure of compassion. The challenge was to find a way to maintain her genuine kindness, her instinct to listen to people, to help when she could, to see the best in others, while also maintaining the protective caution that her circumstances required. In the years following the Oswald incident, Margarethe's reputation underwent a subtle transformation. She was no longer simply the young woman who had been left modest circumstances by her father and who had managed to build a decent tavern. She was now someone to be reckoned with, someone who had navigated difficult circumstances with intelligence and integrity, someone who could not be easily fooled or manipulated. Her tavern became known not only for good beer and fair dealing, but also for discretion and for Margarethe's ability to read people accurately and to judge situations clearly. It was around this time that she began to develop a friendship with a woman named Katharina, whose life had taken a very different trajectory. Katharina had been Margarethe's acquaintance in childhood. They had attended the same religious instruction classes, and they had lost touch over the years. Now Katharina reappeared in Margarethe's life as the wife of a successful merchant, a man of perhaps 50, who had married the considerably younger Katharina in what was understood to be a strategic alliance. Her family gained a connection to wealth and commercial networks. His family gained a young wife who could produce heirs and manage his household. The marriage was not a happy one. Katharina's husband was much older and had little time or patience for her companionship. He was often absent on business. When he was present, he was preoccupied and distant. Katharina was intelligent and lively, and her considerable talents were being wasted in managing a household with plenty of servants and no real autonomy. She began to visit Margarethe's tavern, initially in the company of her husband, but gradually alone, in the afternoons when other customers were few and they could talk privately. Margarethe listened as Katharina described her marriage, her boredom, her sense of being trapped in a comfortable cage. She offered no judgment and little advice, but her presence, her willingness to listen, her evident respect for Katharina's intelligence, became important to Katharina. In Margarethe, Katharina found someone who took her seriously, who did not dismiss her concerns as the complaints of a woman who lacked genuine hardship, who seemed to understand that a gilded cage is still a cage. In Katharina, Margarethe found something else, a window into the world of wealth and power. Katharina heard things, knew things about the city's elite families and their relationships, their conflicts, their secret arrangements. She shared these things with Margarethe in the confidence of friendship. Margarethe, in turn, provided Katharina with something the woman's husband and family could not: genuine companionship based on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. It was through Katharina that Margarethe first heard the name Donna Elisabetta, a widow of considerable means whose household Katharina's husband sometimes conducted business with. It was through Katharina's stories that Margarethe began to understand the complex web of relationships and interests that bound together the city's wealthy families. And it was through Katharina that eventually Margarethe would become entangled in a mystery far more serious than anything she had yet experienced. But that was still in the future. For now, Margarethe was settled in her tavern, secure in her position, respected in her community. She had learned hard lessons about caution and discernment. She had built something that was entirely her own. She had learned to navigate the world on her own terms, constrained by the limitations that her gender and social position imposed, but not defeated by them. She was, in these years, content, not joyfully so, but with the deeper satisfaction that comes from having created something meaningful through work and intelligence. The tavern was her anchor, her proof that she could survive and even flourish in a world that had offered her no guarantees. Margarethe was 32 years old when Donna Elisabetta first walked into her tavern. The widow was perhaps 60, dressed in the dark fabrics appropriate to her station, moving with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to being observed and evaluated. She was accompanied by no one, which was unusual. Women of her social standing did not typically venture into establishments like Margarethe's tavern unattended. Yet Donna Elisabetta seemed entirely at ease with the irregularity of her presence. She sat at a table near the window, accepted a cup of wine with a nod of thanks, and settled into observation as if she had been coming to this place for years. Margarethe noted the woman's arrival, as she noted the arrival of all customers, but she made no special effort to approach her. Long experience had taught her that some people desired conversation and attention, while others came seeking solitude and anonymity. Donna Elisabetta seemed to belong to the latter category. She sipped her wine slowly, watched the other customers with an expression of detached interest, and appeared content with her own company. Yet she returned the following week, and the week after that. A pattern established itself. She came on Thursday afternoons, when the tavern was relatively quiet, ordered wine, sat in the same corner, and departed after an hour or so, without having spoken to anyone. On her fourth visit, she addressed Margarethe directly, asking if the wine came from a particular region. Margarethe answered honestly that it did not. She obtained her wines from a reliable merchant who dealt in honest stock, but nothing exceptional. Donna Elisabetta nodded, as if this answer confirmed something she had suspected, and commented that she appreciated honesty more than she appreciated exceptional quality. The widow's visits became more regular. She began to arrive on different days of the week, and she began to stay longer. She would sometimes bring materials with her, letters, documents, and would spend portions of her time in the tavern reading or writing, pausing occasionally to observe the other customers. Gradually, she and Margarethe began to converse. The conversations were not intimate or particularly personal. They discussed the city, the weather, the quality of goods in the market. They discussed business matters. Donna Elisabetta asked Margarethe questions about how she managed her establishment, how she made decisions about pricing and inventory, how she dealt with difficult customers. Margarethe answered these questions thoughtfully and honestly. She sensed that the widow was evaluating her, testing her judgment, her integrity, her capacity for discernment. Over the course of several months, a genuine connection developed between them, one based not on sentiment or affection, but on mutual respect. Donna Elisabetta was intelligent, well-educated, and possessed of a sharp wit. She had been married for more than 40 years to a man of considerable wealth, and had spent those years managing a complex household, navigating the intricate social relationships of the city's elite, and learning to observe power and its operations with precision. She had no children, which was a source of disappointment, but also, she sometimes suggested, a liberation. It meant that she was not bound by dynastic considerations or the needs of heirs. Her husband had died 3 years before she began visiting Margarethe's tavern. The death had been sudden, a stroke that took him in the night, and it had left Donna Elisabetta wealthy and independent, but also, in many ways, adrift. She had spent a lifetime supporting her husband's interests and managing the complex social world that his position required. Now, she was free to determine her own activities, but that freedom, while genuine, was also somewhat constraining. The city's society did not quite know how to accommodate a wealthy widow who did not wish to remarry, who did not retreat into piety or the company of other women her age, who instead moved through the city with an independence that bordered on eccentricity. It was during one of these afternoon conversations, perhaps 2 years into their acquaintance, that Donna Elisabetta asked Margarethe a question that seemed, on the surface, to be theoretical, but which carried weight beneath it. "If someone entrusted you with something of value," the widow said, "something that they did not wish to be found, something that they believed might be contested after their death, would you be capable of keeping it safe and secret?" Margarethe set down the glass she had been holding and looked directly at Donna Elisabetta. "That depends on what you mean by contested," she said carefully. "If you mean that others might believe they had a right to it, then yes, I would keep it safe. If you mean that it might be evidence of a crime, then I would need to know more before I could answer." Donna Elisabetta smiled slightly, as if she had received exactly the answer she had been expecting. "I mean the former," she said. "I mean that there are documents and a small amount of coin that I have reason to believe certain members of my family would wish to suppress or to claim. I mean that I wish to ensure that, after my death, these items are preserved and delivered to specific people, not to others. I mean that the will I have drawn up may be challenged, and I wish to have insurance against that challenge." "You should speak to a lawyer," Margarethe said. "To the executor you have named. To the church, if you wish religious guarantee of the document's safety." "I have done these things," Donna Elisabetta replied. "Yet I am not entirely confident that formal channels will be sufficient. I have observed too much of human nature to believe that documents placed in obvious locations will remain undisturbed, or that people with sufficient motivation will not find ways to circumvent legal protections. I wish to have the insurance of a location that is unexpected and protected by someone of personal discretion." Margarethe understood, then, what was being asked of her. The widow did not trust the formal systems of law and religion entirely. She wanted a backup, a secret location where her most important possessions could be hidden, guarded by someone outside her family and the web of interests that surrounded it. "Why me?" Margarethe asked. Donna Elisabetta leaned back slightly in her chair. "Because you have demonstrated integrity. Because you listen without judgment. Because you are outside the networks of power and family that might try to access what I wish to protect. Because you are a woman. And there are certain men who assume women cannot be trusted with important matters, This assumption would make your location a good hiding place. And because you have already proven your capacity to refuse manipulation and to resist pressure from people of greater power. The incident with the wine merchant made this clear. Margarethe was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what was being asked. "If I agree to this," she said, "I will need certain guarantees. I will need to know precisely what I am being asked to keep. I will need to know who has the authority to reclaim it. I will need written documentation of these arrangements that I can reference, should questions arise after your death." "Of course," Donna Elisabetta said. "I would expect nothing less. Shall we discuss the details?" Over the following weeks, the arrangements were made. Donna Elisabetta visited Margarethe's tavern several times, and on one occasion she brought with her a locked box made of dark wood, reinforced with iron bands and secured with a heavy lock. The box was, perhaps, the size of a small loaf of bread, not large enough to be obviously valuable, but substantial enough to contain significant documents. The widow gave Margarethe a key and instructions for where the box should be hidden, in the cellar, behind a stone that formed part of the outer wall, a location that was not obvious, but that was accessible. Margarethe swore an oath to keep the box safe, and to deliver it only to the executor named in Donna Elisabetta's will, or to specific individuals the widow named. She swore to open it under no circumstances, to discuss its existence with no one, and to ensure that after the widow's death, it was retrieved by those entitled to it. Donna Elisabetta gave her written instructions, sealed and signed, to be kept with the box itself. She also gave Margarethe a sum of money, payment for the service, and insurance against loss. "I have no expectation that you will be able to prevent all attempts to harm what I have entrusted to you," Donna Elisabetta said as she prepared to leave. "I am not naive, but I have observed that you are intelligent and resourceful. I trust that you will do your best to protect what is in your care, and that you will not be easily intimidated or manipulated into giving it up." The box was hidden in the cellar on a cold afternoon in early winter. Margarethe placed it carefully behind the loose stone, ensuring that it was secure and well concealed. She memorized its location with precision, rehearsing in her mind the exact number of stones from the corner, the exact depth behind the wall. She told no one, not even Magda or Dietrich, though she was certain they must have wondered why she spent an afternoon working alone in the cellar, and why she checked it frequently in the weeks that followed. For several years after the box was hidden, life continued much as it had before. Donna Elisabetta continued to visit the tavern regularly, though with slightly less frequency. She and Margarethe continued their conversations, though their tone shifted slightly. There was now, between them, a secret that created a particular kind of intimacy, and also a particular kind of distance. The widow never explicitly referred to the box or its contents, but Margarethe sensed that Donna Elisabetta took comfort from knowing it was safe, that some portion of her anxiety about what would happen after her death had been relieved by placing her most important possessions in this hidden location. Then, on a cold morning in late winter, Katharina arrived at the tavern shortly after Margarethe had opened. She was disheveled, her face streaked with tears, her entire demeanor one of distress. She asked Margarethe to speak with her privately, and they retreated to the small room behind the bar, where Margarethe kept her accounts and private materials. Katharina's husband had died, she said. The death had been sudden, a seizure or a stroke, the physicians were not certain. He had been ill for only a few hours before he died. Caterina was now a widow, and while her husband's estate was substantial, she was uncertain what her position would be. His family was already making claims on various assets. The household she had lived in might not remain under her control. She was frightened of what her future would hold. Margarethe listened without interrupting, offering what comfort she could. She had no practical solutions to offer. Caterina's situation was genuinely complicated and would require legal and family negotiation to resolve. But she offered support and a sympathetic ear, which seemed to be what Caterina needed most in that moment. After Caterina departed, Margarethe learned through other channels that Donna Elisabetta had also died. The widow had suffered an illness, a sudden and severe sickness that took her within days. The death had occurred only a few weeks after Caterina's husband's death, and the two deaths, occurring so close together in the city, had created a certain amount of disruption and distress. For Margarethe, the death of Donna Elisabetta was also a rupture in the texture of her life. The woman had become, over their years of acquaintance, someone Margarethe genuinely cared for, and her passing left an absence. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by many of the city's important families. Margarethe attended, which caused some raised eyebrows. It was unusual for a tavern keeper to attend the funeral of a wealthy widow. Yet she felt compelled to be there, to pay her respects, to witness the formal closure of a relationship that had been meaningful to her. At the funeral, Margarethe observed Donna Elisabetta's family members. A greedy son named Otto, who had inherited his mother's house and a substantial portion of her wealth. A calculating daughter-in-law, who wore the expression of someone calculating how to maximize her family's advantage. Distant relatives, who seemed to be assessing who would benefit and who would lose from the widow's death. She watched their interactions with one another, noting the tensions, the careful negotiations conducted through glances and subtle gestures, the barely concealed conflicts over wealth and property. She was approached, after the formal ceremony, by a man she recognized as the executor Donna Elisabetta had named in her will. He was perhaps 60 years old, a careful and precise man with a reputation for honesty. He drew Margarethe aside and spoke to her quietly. "The widow trusted you with something," he said. It was not a question. Margarethe hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. "She had my discretion," she said finally. The executor nodded slowly. "She had mine as well. If there is anything you were entrusted to keep safe, I would advise you to preserve it carefully. There are people who will be interested in discovering what the widow valued and why. I would advise you to speak of this matter to no one and to be cautious about who you allow into your confidence." He departed before Margarethe could respond, leaving her with a sense of foreboding that seemed disproportionate to his words, but which she could not quite dismiss. That evening, in the privacy of her room, Margarethe reviewed the sealed instructions that Donna Elisabetta had given her. They specified that the box should be delivered to the executor upon the widow's death. They also specified that Margarethe should use her own judgment about whether the executor was trustworthy, and if she believed him to be corrupt, she should protect the box and consult with the local magistrate. She did not believe the executor to be corrupt, but his warning had aroused her caution. She decided that she would wait, observing events in the city before she delivered the box to him. She wanted to understand why Donna Elisabetta had been so concerned about the contents being disputed. and what the widow had believed might be challenged. Over the weeks and months following Donna Elisabetta's death, Margarethe maintained the box in its hiding place. She began to pay closer attention to conversations in her tavern that involved the widow's family or the settlement of her estate. She listened for hints about what matters were contested, what disputes had arisen, what seemed to be at stake. Gradually, a picture began to form, fragments of information, rumors, hints of conflict, but it remained incomplete. There were clearly matters that Donna Elisabetta's family was disputing, but the precise nature of those disputes remained obscure. It was during this time that Margarethe developed a closer relationship with Anna, the daughter of the woodcarver Friedrich. Anna had grown into a young woman of perhaps 18 or 19, intelligent and skilled in the work of her father's craft. She began to work regularly in the tavern, assisting Magda and gradually learning the trade. She was patient and observant, and she and Margarethe developed a genuine bond of affection and mutual respect. Anna was the first person, outside of Donna Elisabetta herself, that Margarethe fully trusted with her concerns. Not that she told Anna about the box, she kept her oath of silence about that. But she expressed her anxiety about the widow's death, her sense that something significant had been hidden, her uncertainty about what obligations she truly held. "You should trust yourself," Anna said simply, speaking from the practical wisdom that came naturally to her despite her youth. "You keep a secret because someone you respected asked you to. That is enough." Whatever was important enough that she wanted to protect it is still important. Nothing has changed, except that she is gone. Your obligation remains the same. Margarethe found comfort in this clarity, even as she remained uncertain about her precise course of action. She continued to wait, to listen, to observe, while the box remained hidden in the cellar, waiting for the moment when its contents would become relevant or when she would understand fully what obligation she truly held. In the years following Donna Elisabetta's death, the city continued its complex dance of commerce and power. Margarethe's tavern continued to prosper. Her reputation for discretion and integrity continued to grow. Yet she carried, always, the knowledge of the hidden box and the secrets it contained, a weight that was not burdensome, but which was always present, a reminder that even in the quiet security of her established business, there were currents and depths that she had barely begun to understand. The city in those years seemed to exist in a state of perpetual tension, held together by commerce and the careful balance of competing interests, yet fragile in ways that Margarethe was only beginning to fully perceive. The seasons turned, and with them came new merchants, new conflicts, new configurations of power. Margarethe's tavern, positioned at the intersection of multiple social worlds, had become a kind of sounding board for the city's anxieties and ambitions. It was here that fragments of information accumulated, that tensions surfaced in unguarded moments, that the hidden currents beneath the surface of ordinary life became briefly visible. It was perhaps 3 years after Donna Elisabetta's death that the first significant hint emerged, not in the form of a direct revelation, but through the loose talk of a merchant named Ludolf, a man of perhaps 50, who dealt in rare goods and who frequented the tavern several times each month. Ludolf was a drinker, not in the sense that he consumed excessive quantities of alcohol, but in the sense that wine loosened his tongue and released things he normally kept guarded. One evening, after his 3rd cup, he mentioned casually to another customer, a conversation that Margarethe overheard while ostensibly occupied with cleaning glasses, that he had never believed Donna Elisabeta's death was natural. "Poison," he said, his voice dropping. "I would wager my portion of next season's trade that she was poisoned. Slowly, deliberately. The symptoms match what I have heard described: a wasting illness, fever, confusion. There is a substance that produces such effects. A man in Venice sold it to me years ago, before he disappeared. I never used it, but I remember what he said about it. It works slowly enough that it can pass for natural illness." The other customer dismissed this speculation as the imaginings of a man who had drunk too much wine. Ludolf retreated into silence, apparently aware that he had said too much. Yet the seed had been planted in Margarethe's mind, and it took root and began to grow. She found herself reconsidering Donna Elisabeta's death, the rapidity of it, yes, but also the quality of it. The widow had complained in her final visits to the tavern of a mild illness, nothing serious, but something that did not quite resolve. And then quite suddenly it had accelerated into something severe and ultimately fatal. Margarethe did not share this speculation with anyone. Instead, she began to listen more intently to conversations that touched upon Donna Elisabeta's family or their affairs. She learned, through fragments of information, that there had been disputes within the family about the widow's will, about whether certain bequests were legitimate, about whether certain assets should be contested. She learned that Herr Otto, Donna Elisabeta's son, had significant debts that had been incurred in speculation on merchant ventures that had failed. She learned that there were tensions between Otto and certain other wealthy families in the city over trading rights and commercial arrangements. She began to understand that Donna Elisabeta had likely possessed information that was valuable to multiple parties, information that someone had deemed dangerous enough to warrant her removal from the world. Whether this had actually occurred, or whether Ludolf's speculation was merely the imaginative excess of a drunken mind, Margarethe could not be certain. But the possibility hung in the air, and it changed the quality of her guardianship of the hidden box. What had seemed like a matter of honoring the widow's wishes now seemed potentially to touch upon something far darker. It was during these years that the city's political situation became increasingly complicated. The bishop and the city council were engaged in ongoing disputes over taxation and authority. A new magistrate arrived, appointed by the Prince Archbishop, to oversee certain matters of justice and administration. This magistrate, a man named Heinrich von Bruch, was ambitious and intelligent. He was searching for cases that would make his reputation, for wrongs that he could right, for crimes that he could solve. He was the sort of man who could become either a genuine agent of justice or a tool for the accumulation of power, depending on circumstances and the influence of those around him. During his first season in the city, von Bruch's investigations touched upon various merchant families and their affairs. He questioned people about trades that seemed suspicious, about prices that seemed inflated, about business arrangements that might violate guild regulations or church law. He was looking for evidence of wrongdoing that could be prosecuted and that would demonstrate his competence to his superiors. It was perhaps inevitable that his attention would eventually turn toward Herr Otto and the other wealthy merchant families whose conflicts were conducted, at least partially, in Margarethe's tavern. Various patrons began to attempt to use the tavern as a location for private conversations and negotiations, offering Margarethe money to ensure that they would not be disturbed, that their meetings would remain confidential, that no information about their presence would leak to competitors or to the magistrate's office. Margarethe found herself in a delicate position. She had always honored confidentiality. It was the foundation upon which her reputation was built. Yet she was also aware that some of these conversations likely involved matters that might be of interest to the authorities. A man attempted to recruit her, through the intermediary of an associate, to provide information to the magistrate about Otto's business activities. A woman, the wife of one of the competing merchants, approached her and asked if Margarethe had overheard conversations that might indicate Otto was engaged in illegal trade. Margarethe refused all such requests with careful consistency. She did not sell information. She did not take sides in disputes. She honored confidentiality absolutely. When people pressed her, she was firm but not unkind. She explained that her business depended upon trust, and that trust could not be selective or conditional. If she were willing to betray the confidences of one patron for the right price or the right incentive, she would betray the confidences of all. Therefore, she betrayed the confidences of none. Yet this principled stance did not entirely protect her. She began to feel watched, to sense that her activities were being observed with interest by people with power and resources to act on what they learned. A man who claimed to represent the magistrate's office visited her, ostensibly to inquire about a matter of taxation related to the tavern, but his questions seemed to probe beyond the ostensible purpose. He asked her about her customers, about who came frequently, about what kinds of conversations occurred in her establishment. Margarethe answered in generalities, providing nothing specific. Around this time, Anna's father, Friedrich the woodcarver, began to express anxiety about his daughter's work in the tavern. He was a careful man, not given to excessive emotion, but he was clearly troubled. He approached Margarethe one evening after closing, when Anna was not present, and spoke to her directly. "I am grateful for the opportunity you have provided my daughter," he said carefully. "She has learned much working for you, and the wages have been valuable to our household. Yet I am concerned about the currents moving through the city. I hear things, rumors about investigations, about powerful families engaged in disputes that may become dangerous. I worry that if Anna is present in your tavern, she may become entangled in matters that are not her concern. I worry that she might be questioned or pressured or exposed to things that could damage her reputation or her future prospects." Margarethe understood his concern, and she took it seriously. "Anna is valuable to me," she said. "I have no wish to expose her to danger. If you believe it would be safer for her to leave my employ, I will not stop you. But I would also say that I am careful about what conversations I permit in my tavern, and I would not allow her to be mistreated or subjected to pressure. If she remains with me, I will protect her as I protect all who work for me." Friedrich seemed to take some comfort from this assurance. The Margarethe sensed that his anxiety did not entirely dissipate. He did not forbid Anna from working in the tavern, but he became more vigilant, more protective, and there was a quality of strain in his relationship with his daughter that had not been present before. It was during this period that Katharina became increasingly important to Margarethe as a source of information and insight. Katharina had recovered from the initial shock of her husband's death and had established a new life as a widow of means. She was now involved in the social networks of the city's wealthy families in a way that Margarethe could never be, and she had access to information, gossip certainly, but also substantive knowledge about the conflicts and interests that animated elite circles. Caterina revealed to Margarethe that there were serious questions about the authenticity of certain documents relating to her own husband's estate and to business arrangements he had made before his death. She spoke of rumors that documents had been forged, that debts had been falsified, that certain merchant families had been attempting to manipulate business arrangements and property transfers. She suggested that these frauds might extend beyond her husband's affairs and might involve other families as well. More significantly, Caterina mentioned that there had been whispers about Donna Elisabetta, that the widow had possessed evidence of various frauds and illegal activities, and that certain people would have preferred that she remain silent. Caterina did not explicitly accuse anyone of poisoning the widow, but the suggestion was clearly present in what she said.
"I am telling you this," Caterina said to Margarethe one afternoon when they were alone in the tavern, "because I trust you, and because I think you should understand what currents you are swimming in. You are seen as someone who is outside the major networks of power, someone whose discretion is absolute. This makes you valuable to people who wish to keep secrets. But it also makes you potentially dangerous to people who have secrets they wish to keep hidden. Be careful." Margarethe took this warning seriously. She began to be more deliberate about whom she allowed into her tavern and what conversations she permitted to occur there. She became more observant of the relationships between various patrons, more attentive to the substance of their conversations, more alert to signs that she was being manipulated or used in ways she did not fully understand. One afternoon, a man arrived at the tavern whom she had never seen before. He was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, carrying himself with the bearing of someone educated and accustomed to authority. He asked for a private room where he could conduct a conversation, and he offered Margarethe a substantial sum of money to ensure that he would not be disturbed. Margarethe accepted the payment, but informed him that she could not guarantee absolute privacy. Her tavern was a business, and other customers might require access to the room. He seemed to accept this limitation. She showed him to a small room at the back of the tavern, separate from the main space, where patrons sometimes conducted private business. Later that evening, she ascertained, through careful and subtle questioning of Caterina, that the man was an associate of Herr Otto's, and that he had been in Mainz conducting business related to Otto's various ventures and disputes. The man remained in the city for several weeks and visited the tavern multiple times, always requesting the same private room. Margarethe maintained strict confidentiality about his presence and his conversations, but she could not help but be aware of him, and she began to sense, from the tension in his demeanor and the careful nature of his conversations, that matters of significant consequence were being negotiated. Then, one morning, the man did not appear at his usual time. When Margarethe inquired through various channels, she learned that he had departed the city the previous evening, quite suddenly, without completing certain business arrangements he had been negotiating. He had left behind a reputation as someone who had attempted to manipulate or defraud various merchants, and his sudden departure suggested that he had been discovered or exposed in some significant way. It was around this time that Margarethe began, tentatively and carefully, to piece together a possible narrative. She did not have all the information she would have needed to be certain, but the fragments she possessed suggested a story. Donna Elisabetta had possessed evidence, documents perhaps, of fraud or illegal activity involving multiple wealthy families. She had threatened to expose this evidence, or had been believed to threaten it. Someone, or perhaps multiple people working together, had decided that her death would be preferable to the consequences of her revelations. She had been poisoned, though the poison had been administered in a way that made the death appear natural. After her death, her family had begun to fight over her estate, perhaps because various parties believed that the evidence she had protected was still hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. The box that Margarethe kept hidden in her cellar might contain this evidence. Or it might contain something else entirely. Without opening it, and Margarethe had sworn that she would not open it, she could not be certain. This knowledge created a particular kind of tension in her daily life. She moved through her tavern, served her customers, maintained her reputation for discretion and integrity, while carrying the awareness that she was guardian of something potentially dangerous. The box was hidden, but its existence was not truly secret. Donna Elisabetta had taken precautions to conceal it, but any sufficiently motivated person might discover it, given time and resources. The mere fact of its existence, the knowledge that the widow had entrusted something valuable to someone outside her family, was knowledge that certain people would find valuable. Margarethe began to take precautions. She ensured that the cellar was always locked. She varied her routine so that no one could predict when she descended to check on the hidden stone. She cultivated relationships with people who had power or influence, not explicitly, but through the simple fact of treating everyone with respect and dignity, of offering them a space where they could be heard and understood. She believed, perhaps naively, that if she had cultivated sufficient goodwill, no one would wish to harm her, and that her neutrality would provide her with protection. Yet, there was also a growing awareness as the years passed that neutrality itself could be a kind of vulnerability. By refusing to take sides, by maintaining relationships with people who were in conflict with one another, she placed herself in a position where any of those people might eventually decide that she was more valuable to them as a controlled asset than as an independent entity. The delicate balance she had maintained through intelligence and careful judgment might at any moment tip toward danger. It was Anna who first directly addressed this tension with her. One evening, when they were alone in the tavern after closing, Anna asked Margarethe if she was afraid. "Afraid of what?" Margarethe replied, though she understood the question perfectly well. "Of whatever it is you are guarding," Anna said simply. "Of whoever might be trying to find it. Of the consequences, if things go wrong." Margarethe was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally, "I am afraid. But fear is not a sufficient reason to betray a trust. Donna Elisabetta placed something in my care because she believed I was capable of preserving it despite fear. To abandon that trust at the first sign of danger would be to prove her judgment wrong." Anna nodded slowly. "Then I will help you," she said. "Whatever you need, I will help you." Margarethe reached out and took the young woman's hand. "Your help is valuable," she said, "but be careful. Do not expose yourself to danger on my behalf. What matters is that the secret is kept, not by whom it is kept or what price is paid for keeping it." The city continued its turning, its patterns of commerce and conflict, its slow accumulation of tensions beneath the surface. Margarethe continued her work, serving her customers, maintaining her reputation, guarding her secret. The box remained hidden, waiting in darkness, its contents slowly becoming more significant with the passing of time, more dangerous in the knowledge that it existed and that certain people desperately wished to know what it contained.
The investigation into the death of Donna Elisabetta began not with a sudden revelation, but with the methodical persistence of Magistrate Heinrich von Bruch, a man whose ambition was matched by his genuine competence. It commenced, as such investigations often do, with a question that seemed almost incidental, a routine inquiry about property disputes and contested wills that had accumulated during his tenure in the city. Yet as he pulled at one thread, others began to unravel, and what had appeared to be ordinary disputes among wealthy families began to reveal patterns that suggested something far more serious. The investigation accelerated when a merchant, a man named Casper, who had known Donna Elisabetta and had respected her, approached the magistrate with concerns about the widow's death. Casper had attended various business gatherings with her over the years and had observed her intelligence and her careful attention to matters of commerce and propriety. He suggested, carefully but directly, that he had never believed her death to be natural. He suggested that the timing of it, occurring just before certain business arrangements were to be finalized and certain documents were to be produced, was suspicious. He suggested that the magistrate ought to consider the possibility of foul play. Von Bruch was not a man prone to speculation without evidence, but he was intrigued enough to pursue the matter further. He consulted with physicians about the symptoms that had been described as accompanying Donna Elisabetta's final illness. He examined the records of her death more carefully. He began to ask questions about who had benefited from her death, who had been present in her household during her final illness, what arrangements had been made regarding her estate. Herr Otto, Donna Elisabetta's son, was questioned. The interrogation was not confrontational initially, merely a formal inquiry into the circumstances of his mother's death. Yet, as von Bruch listened to Otto's responses and observed his demeanor, he sensed something evasive, something that did not quite align with what other people had described. Otto was defensive about his relationship with his mother, irritable when questioned about her health and her final days, and oddly focused on matters of property and inheritance rather than on grief or the loss of his mother. More significantly, Otto revealed during his interrogation that he had been estranged from his mother in the months before her death. He acknowledged that there had been disputes about his inheritance and about the will. He admitted that his mother had been displeased with certain business ventures he had undertaken. He revealed, almost against his will, that his mother had threatened to disinherit him or to restrict his access to certain portions of her estate. Von Bruch was interested in this information, but it was not enough to constitute evidence of a crime. What it did constitute was motive, a clear and compelling reason why Otto might wish his mother dead. Combined with the medical evidence that suggested poisoning was a possibility, and with a general timeline of events, the pieces began to fit together into a narrative that justified further investigation. It was during this period that Margarethe first encountered the magistrate's interest in the matter. A man arrived at her tavern in the early afternoon, a time when few other customers were present, and asked to speak with her privately. He identified himself as an agent working for Magistrate von Bruch's office, and he explained that the magistrate was conducting an investigation into matters relating to Donna Elisabetta's death and certain subsequent disputes within the city's merchant community. Margarethe's initial reaction was caution. She did not know what this investigation might lead to, and she was uncertain whether revealing information she possessed, or even acknowledging that she possessed information, might endanger her position or compromise her reputation for confidentiality. The agent was tactful in his approach.
He explained that the magistrate was not attempting to interfere with private conversations or to undermine confidentiality in business matters. Rather, he was attempting to determine whether certain crimes had occurred, and he believed that a person of Margarethe's position, someone who was in contact with multiple segments of the city's population and who was known for careful observation, might be able to provide useful context without betraying any specific confidences. "I cannot reveal what is told to me in confidence," Margarethe said directly. "My reputation is built upon confidentiality, and without it, my business would not survive." "Understood," the agent replied.
I would not ask you to compromise that principle. Yet surely you can provide general information. For instance, you can tell us whether you have observed tensions between certain families. You can describe the general atmosphere in the city regarding various disputes. You need not attribute any specific statement to any specific person. Margarethe considered this carefully. She was not opposed to justice being served, and she was not opposed to the investigation of potential crimes. Yet she was also aware that investigations conducted by magistrates could be messy, intrusive, and potentially used for purposes other than justice. She was uncertain whether cooperating with this investigation would ultimately serve her interests or endanger them. "I will speak with Magistrate von Bruck directly," she said finally. "If he wishes to question me, he is welcome to do so. But I will not provide information through intermediaries, and I will not put myself in a position where my words might be misrepresented or used in ways I did not intend." The agent seemed to have expected this response. He departed with a message that the magistrate would be in contact with her. 3 days later, Margarethe was summoned to the magistrate's office. The office was located in a building that housed various civic functions, not far from the cathedral. The room itself was sparsely furnished: a desk, several chairs, shelves holding documents and records. Magistrate von Bruck was a man in his mid-50s, with a stern face and keen eyes that suggested both intelligence and a capacity for ruthlessness. He welcomed Margarethe with formal courtesy and invited her to sit. "I understand you operate an establishment that serves a diverse clientele," he began without preamble. "That you have customers from various social stations and commercial interests." "Is this accurate?" "Yes," Margarethe replied simply, "and I understand that you maintain strict confidentiality regarding conversations that occur in your tavern. That you do not reveal what is told to you, nor do you allow such information to be extracted from you through pressure or inducement. Is this also accurate?" "It is." Von Bruck nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had been told. "I am not here to compromise that principle," he said. "I am here to investigate the death of Donna Elisabetta and to determine whether she died from natural causes or from deliberate poisoning. To do this effectively, I need to understand the state of relationships within the city's merchant community. I need to understand what conflicts existed, what tensions were present, what disputes might have motivated certain actions." He paused, allowing Margarethe to respond if she wished. She remained silent, waiting to hear what he actually wanted from her. "I understand that Donna Elisabetta was a patron of your establishment," von Bruck continued. "That you knew her, at least peripherally. I would like to know what you observed about her state of mind in the months before her death. I would like to know whether she seemed troubled, whether she expressed concerns about her safety or her family, whether she indicated that she was in possession of information that might be dangerous or valuable." Margarethe considered her answer carefully.
Donna Elisabetta was a thoughtful woman, she said. She seemed to observe the world with precision and to think about what she observed. In the months before her death, I would characterize her demeanor as concerned but not panicked. She seemed to be conducting her affairs with deliberation and care.
Was she afraid? Von Bruck asked directly.
Margarethe hesitated. To say yes might imply knowledge she did not wish to reveal. To say no might be dishonest.
I would say she was cautious, she finally replied. But cautiousness is not the same as fear.
Von Bruck seemed satisfied with this answer, or at least he did not press further on this point. Instead, he shifted to a different line of questioning. I understand that various disputes have occurred within the merchant community in recent years. Disputes over trading rights, over the authenticity of documents, over debts and claims. You have been present in a location where such disputes might be discussed. Have you observed anything that would suggest systematic fraud or manipulation on the part of certain individuals? Again, Margarethe was cautious. She did not wish to make accusations without evidence, nor did she wish to implicate specific people based on fragments of overheard conversations. Yet she recognized that a general acknowledgement of the existence of such disputes could be made without compromising anyone's confidentiality. There have been tensions, she said. Disputes that involve questions of document authenticity, of proper accounting, of the terms under which credit has been extended. These are not unique to Mainz. They are common in any city where commerce is conducted. Of course, von Bruck agreed. Yet, in some cases, such disputes may indicate something more serious than ordinary business disagreement. They may indicate deliberate fraud. They may indicate crimes that go beyond simple commerce. He was quiet for a moment, seeming to make a decision about how much to reveal. I will speak with you as one person to another, he said finally. Not as magistrate to tavern keeper, but as a man interested in justice to a woman I believe also cares about justice. I believe that Donna Elisabetta was poisoned. I believe this was done deliberately, by someone with access to her household and with motive to see her dead. I believe that her death was related to information she possessed about illegal activities conducted by certain wealthy families. And I believe that before she died, she took steps to protect that information by placing it somewhere safe. Margarethe's heart quickened, but she kept her expression composed. The magistrate was describing, with remarkable accuracy, the situation that she was dealing with. The question now was what he knew, how he knew it, and what he intended to do with that knowledge. Von Bruck watched her face carefully, as if assessing her reaction. I believe you know something about this matter, he said quietly. I do not believe you are guilty of any crime, but I believe you may have information that is relevant to my investigation. And I am asking you, as one person to another, whether you would be willing to share that information. Margarethe took a moment before responding. If I knew something relevant to a crime, she said, I would need to be certain that sharing that knowledge would serve justice rather than politics or personal interest. I would need to understand what would be done with the information and how it would be used. Fair enough, von Bruck said. Let me tell you what I know. Donna Elisabetta died of poisoning administered over a period of weeks, as far as I can determine from medical evidence. Her son, Herr Otto,
had motive. He was facing disinheritance or significant restrictions on his inheritance. His associates had motive. They were benefiting from various fraudulent schemes that Donna Elisabetta was aware of and that she threatened to expose. I am attempting to determine who administered the poison and whether there was coordination between multiple parties. To do this, I need evidence. And I believe that evidence may be in the form of documents that Donna Elisabetta protected before her death. He paused, letting the implication of this statement settle. "Will you help me?" he asked directly. Margarethe was caught between her oath to Donna Elisabetta and her desire to see justice done. She did not trust the magistrate completely. She had learned years ago not to trust any man with unchecked power. Yet she also recognized that refusing to cooperate with a legitimate investigation into a crime might make her complicit in allowing the guilty to escape punishment. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "I gave my word to someone I cared for that I would protect something for her. I cannot simply abandon that word without serious consideration. But I am also aware that if a crime was committed, it should be answered for. Give me time. I will come to you if I am able to help." Von Bruck seemed to accept this response. "I will not pressure you," he said. "But I would ask you to consider this. If you remain silent, and if the person responsible for Donna Elisabetta's death goes unpunished, are you truly honoring her memory? Or are you failing her in a different way?" Margarethe left the magistrate's office in a state of considerable agitation. She understood the logic of his argument, and she suspected that he was correct in his overall assessment of what had occurred. Yet the decision he was asking her to make was profound. To reveal the box and its location would require her to break her oath. It would also expose her and her tavern to the complex aftermath of such a revelation. Legal proceedings, public attention, the potential enmity of powerful families. That evening she found herself unable to focus on the ordinary work of running the tavern. She moved through the motions, serving customers, managing the bar, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. But her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Donna Elisabetta, about the widow's careful preparation of the box, about her evident anxiety that what she valued would be lost or corrupted after her death. She thought about the burden of keeping a secret, about whether that burden had been worth carrying. When closing time came and the last customers had departed, she descended to the cellar. She moved through the darkness to the familiar location, touched the loose stone, and simply sat in the darkness for a long time, not opening the box, but simply acknowledging its presence, its weight, its significance. Finally, she went to find Anna, who had already retired for the evening to the small room she occupied in the tavern. Margarethe knocked, and Anna emerged, still dressed but clearly preparing for sleep. "I need your counsel," Margarethe said, "not as my employee, but as someone I trust. The magistrate is investigating Donna Elisabetta's death. He believes she was poisoned. He believes I know something about documents she protected. He is asking for my help." Anna listened without interrupting. When Margarethe finished, the young woman was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to honor my oath," Margarethe said. "But I am beginning to wonder if honoring a secret is the same as honoring the person who asked me to keep it. Donna Elisabetta wanted her information protected, yes, but I think she also wanted justice. I think she wanted the truth about what had been done to her to be known." "Then you should give the magistrate what he needs," Anna said simply. The oath was to protect her interests, not to protect the people who harmed her. If the documents serve justice, then you are still honoring the oath. You are still doing what she asked, protecting what was important to her. Margarethe found comfort in this perspective. She realized that she had been thinking about her oath too narrowly, as if it were an absolute prohibition against revealing the box's existence. But the actual intent of the oath, she now understood, was to ensure that the information within the box served the purposes Donna Elisabetta had intended, to expose fraud and wrongdoing, and to prevent the guilty from escaping consequence. The next morning, she returned to the magistrate's office and told him what he needed to know. The retrieval of the box from its hiding place occurred on a gray morning in early spring, when the city was beginning to stir from winter's grip, but the streets remained cold and damp. Margarethe descended to the cellar with Magistrate von Bruck and 2 of his assistants. She moved directly to the location she had maintained so carefully in her memory. The precise stone, the exact distance from the corner, and indicated where the box was concealed. One of the magistrate's men removed it carefully. The wood darkened by years of dampness and shadow, the iron bands still secure. The box was brought to the magistrate's office. Margarethe was present when it was opened, though the actual unsealing occurred in her presence, but not with her participation. The magistrate had, in recognition of her role in preserving the box and in honor of her cooperation, allowed her to be present for the opening. This was, she understood, both a courtesy and an assertion of his authority. He was demonstrating that while her participation was valued, the ultimate control of the contents remained with the law. Within the box were exactly what she had suspected: documents, carefully written records, accounts, letters, all bearing signatures and dates. They outlined a systematic scheme of fraud conducted over a period of years. They documented the forging of merchant documents, the falsification of debts, the manipulation of credit arrangements. They named specific individuals as participants in these frauds, and critically, they identified which families had been victimized by these schemes and which had benefited from them. Donna Elisabetta had been thorough. She had not merely observed the fraud, she had gathered evidence with methodical precision. She had documented when, where, and how the illegal activities had occurred. She had preserved proof of the involvement of multiple parties. She had, in essence, created a legal case against the people responsible for the frauds. The name of Herr Otto appeared frequently throughout the documents, though not always as the primary architect of the schemes. More often, he appeared as a participant, someone who had benefited from frauds conducted by others, but who had not necessarily orchestrated them. The documents suggested that Otto had been manipulated by more sophisticated operators, men with better access to the mechanisms of commercial power, men with connections to the city's administrative structure. One name appeared with particular frequency, that of a man named Burkhardt, a merchant who held considerable influence within certain guild structures and who had connections to the cathedral chapter. Burkhardt appeared to have been one of the primary architects of the fraud schemes. He had used his legitimate commercial standing to mask the illegal activities, and he had involved various other merchants and officials in the schemes, creating a network of complicity that was difficult to untangle. Von Bruck studied the documents with intense focus. As he read, Margarethe could see the shape of the investigation crystallizing in his mind, the connections, the motivations, the scope of what had occurred. This was, she understood, the moment when a potential case became a real case, when suspicions transformed into documented evidence. "These documents are extraordinary," von Bruch said finally. "They are detailed, specific, and damning. They constitute evidence of systematic fraud conducted over years. More significantly, they provide motive for Donna Elisabetha's death. If she was threatening to reveal this information, multiple people would have had reason to see her dead." He looked at Margarethe directly. "You have done a significant thing," he said. "You have potentially brought justice for a murdered woman and exposed criminals who thought themselves secure. You have also placed yourself in a position of some danger." This statement was not reassuring. Margarethe felt a chill at the acknowledgement of what she had already begun to suspect, that by revealing the box and its contents, she had made herself a threat to powerful people who had much to lose if the fraud schemes were exposed and prosecuted. "What will happen now?" she asked. "Now I will conduct a thorough investigation," von Bruch replied. "I will question the individuals named in these documents. I will attempt to gather additional evidence to corroborate what is written here. I will, if the evidence warrants it, bring charges against those responsible for both the frauds and for Donna Elisabetha's death. But this will take time. These are complex matters involving multiple parties and significant sums of money and property. The investigation will be slow, methodical, and thorough." He paused, seeming to consider how much to tell her. "I would advise you to be cautious in the coming weeks and months," he continued. "There are people who will quickly learn that you were responsible for revealing this information. Some of them will be grateful, as they are people who were defrauded and who wish to see justice done. But others will view you as a threat, as someone who has exposed their illegal activities and endangered their positions and fortunes. I cannot guarantee your safety in all circumstances, but I can assure you that if harm comes to you, the investigation into that harm will be conducted with the full weight of my office behind it." Over the following weeks, the magistrate's investigation accelerated. Herr Otto was arrested and questioned intensely. Despite the evidence contained in Donna Elisabetha's documents, Otto denied involvement in his mother's death, claiming that he had not known the full extent of the frauds, and that he had certainly not arranged her murder. He suggested that others, Burkhard and the men connected to him, had orchestrated everything, including his mother's death, because they feared her knowledge and her potential to expose them. Burkhard, when he was brought in for questioning, was more defensive and more careful in his statements. He denied the charges vigorously, claiming that Donna Elisabetha had misunderstood the business arrangements she had observed, that the documents were not authentic, that they had been forged or taken out of context. Yet even as he made these denials, it was clear to anyone observing him that he knew the documents were genuine and that he understood the legal jeopardy he was facing. The investigation became public knowledge within days. The news spread through the city's merchant community like fire through dry wood. Various families realized that their participation in the frauds had been documented. Creditors and debtors realized that debts they believed to be legitimate might actually be the result of fraudulent manipulation. The entire commercial structure of the city seemed to wobble as people attempted to reassess which arrangements were genuine and which were corrupted. And, as von Bruch had warned, people began to understand that Margarethe had been responsible for bringing the investigation to the magistrate's attention. The revelation of her role was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. Magistrate von Bruch had not hidden the source of his evidence.
and word spread through conversations and whispered comments, until it became common knowledge that the tavern keeper had cooperated with the investigation and had provided the magistrate with evidence. The consequences were mixed. Some people who had been defrauded and who viewed the investigation with gratitude began to express their appreciation to Margarethe. A merchant whose large debt had been shown to be fraudulently created approached her and offered to pay her a substantial sum in gratitude for her role in exposing the fraud. She declined the payment, but accepted his thanks. Yet there were others, people connected to Burkhardt and the fraud schemes, people who stood to lose significantly if convictions resulted, who viewed Margarethe with suspicion and potential hostility. She began to notice that she was being watched. Men whose faces she did not recognize would linger in or near her tavern. Someone broke into the tavern one night, searching for something. Nothing was taken, but the violation was clear and terrifying. Margarethe found herself moving through her daily routines with heightened awareness, constantly assessing threats, never fully relaxed. Anna was the first to notice the deterioration in Margarethe's demeanor. She approached her one evening after the other customers had departed and spoke to her directly.
"You are afraid," Anna said. It was not a question.
"Yes," Margarethe admitted. "I made a choice to reveal the box. I believed it was the right choice. But now I am living with the consequences of that choice. And I am beginning to understand that those consequences may be serious." "You should tell the magistrate," Anna said. "Tell him that you are being threatened." "I am not certain I am being threatened," Margarethe said. "The break-in might have been ordinary theft. The men watching might be coincidence. I am afraid, yes, but I cannot point to specific threats." Yet the tension continued to build. Anna's father, Friedrich, began to insist more strongly that his daughter leave her employment in the tavern. He had heard, through various channels, about the break-in and about the attention Margarethe was receiving. He was terrified that Anna would become entangled in whatever danger Margarethe was facing. Anna refused to leave. "You helped me," she said to Margarethe. "You gave me work and respect and treated me as a person of value. I will not abandon you now when you need support." But the strain on Anna was visible. She was frightened, and she was caught between her loyalty to her father and her loyalty to Margarethe. Friedrich's concern for his daughter was genuine and justified, and Margarethe found herself wrestling with guilt about the danger she had exposed Anna to by allowing her to remain employed in the tavern. It was during this period that Margarethe made a decision. She would go to the magistrate and tell him about the break-in and the surveillance. She would ask for his counsel about whether she needed to take specific precautions. She would also, she decided, be more deliberate about setting boundaries. She would close the tavern on certain evenings, would limit her hours, would reduce her exposure to potential danger by reducing her visibility. When she met with von Bruck, he took her concerns seriously. He increased the frequency of his agents' patrols through her part of the city. He suggested that she might consider removing valuable items from the tavern and securing her residence more carefully. He also confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that certain people connected to the fraud investigation did view her as a threat, and that while they might not directly harm her, murder would attract attention they could not afford. They might attempt to intimidate her or to destroy her business through other means. "You have made enemies," von Bruck said bluntly. "This was the inevitable consequence of your cooperation with the investigation. I would not counsel you to regret that cooperation. You have done what was right and what was necessary. But I would counsel you to understand that there may be costs associated with being a person of integrity in a world where many people do not share that value. Yet as the weeks passed and the investigation progressed, another dynamic began to emerge. The very fact that Margarethe had cooperated with the magistrate and had done so openly, without trying to hide her involvement or to deny it, began to work in her favor. She was seen as someone who was not corrupt, who did not seek to profit from wrongdoing, who valued justice over safety or financial gain. The people who had been harmed by the frauds came to respect her. They began to protect her subtly and indirectly, making it known that any harm that came to Margarethe would be dealt with severely. More significantly, the magistrate himself seemed to be developing a genuine respect for Margarethe's character and judgment. He began to consult with her informally about various matters related to the investigation and the city's commercial disputes. He valued her perspective, her ability to read people, her understanding of how power and interest moved through the city's various communities. At one point, during a private conversation, von Bruck asked her directly, "Have you ever considered a more formal role, working directly for the city authorities? Your skills are considerable, and you are clearly capable of handling complex matters with discretion." Margarethe declined respectfully. She explained that her tavern was her life's work, that it was the manifestation of her independence and her choices, and that she could not abandon it for even a more prestigious position. What she valued, she told the magistrate, was not status or wealth or formal power, but the autonomy to live according to her own values and to maintain the space she had created. As the investigation reached its conclusion, the shape of the crime became clear. Donna Elisabetta had been deliberately poisoned by a man hired specifically for the task. The man was a servant in Otto's household, though the evidence suggested that he had been instructed to do so by Burkhardt and his associates rather than directly by Otto. Otto had benefited from his mother's death, certainly, but he had not orchestrated it. He had been, in some ways, a pawn in a larger game, played by men with more power and more at stake. The poison used had been administered over several weeks, mixed into her food or drink in quantities small enough not to be immediately lethal, but large enough to accumulate and eventually overwhelm her system. It had been done with care and precision, designed to appear as natural illness rather than deliberate murder. The fact that it had succeeded for as long as it had, that Donna Elisabetta had been dead for years before the poisoning was even suspected, spoke to the sophistication and confidence of the people who had arranged it. Yet the documents in the box had disrupted the perfect crime. They had provided the evidence needed to suspect foul play. They had opened the possibility of investigation. And investigation had led to the discovery of the truth. The trial, when it came, was a public spectacle in the way that serious matters of justice often are in cities where commerce and reputation are intertwined. The court proceedings were held in the cathedral, in a space designated for such formal proceedings, and the city's population crowded into every available space to observe. The accused, Burkhardt, and the servant who had actually administered the poison, and several other men implicated in the fraud schemes, were brought before the magistrate and the appointed judges to hear the evidence against them. Margarethe did not attend the trial. She had been consulted by the magistrate's office regarding the authenticity of the documents and her role in preserving them, but she had not been called to testify as a witness. Her role in the investigation was known, but remained peripheral to the formal proceedings. Instead, she remained in her tavern, aware that something significant was occurring in the city, but occupied with the ordinary work of her business. The trial lasted several days. Witnesses were called. Experts examined the documents and testified to their authenticity. Merchants who had been defrauded testified about the schemes and their consequences.
Physicians examined evidence regarding Donna Elisabetha's death and offered technical testimony about the mechanisms of poisoning. The accused were given the opportunity to defend themselves, and they did so with varying degrees of success. Some denying involvement entirely, others attempting to minimize their culpability by suggesting that they had been duped or manipulated into participation. The verdicts came with the weight of extensive evidence and careful deliberation. Burckhardt was found guilty of orchestrating the fraud schemes and of conspiracy in the murder of Donna Elisabetha. The servant who had administered the poison was found guilty of murder. Several other men were found guilty of participation in the fraud schemes or conspiracy to commit fraud. The verdicts were not universally unexpected, given the strength of the evidence, but they carried nonetheless a kind of shock. The realization that crimes so brazen and so carefully concealed had actually occurred, had been discovered, and were now being punished. The sentences were severe. Burckhardt and the servant were sentenced to death, execution to be carried out publicly, a spectacle of justice that would serve as warning to others. The other men received sentences involving substantial fines, confiscation of property, and various terms of imprisonment or banishment from the city. For the men involved in the fraud schemes, the consequences were economically devastating. Wealth that had been accumulated through illegal means was seized by the city. Business relationships that had been built on fraudulent foundations collapsed. Word reached Margarethe of the verdicts through various channels. Customers arrived with news and commentary. Katerina visited to tell her the results and to confirm that the investigation had concluded successfully. The magistrate sent a formal messenger to express his respect and appreciation for her cooperation. Yet the aftermath of the trial was more complex than simple resolution. Herr Otto, though he had not been convicted of murder, had been implicated heavily in the investigation. His reputation was destroyed. His business relationships, many of which had been built on the fraudulent foundations that had now been exposed, began to dissolve. Creditors who had believed they had legitimate claims against him now found those claims questioned. Merchants who had done business with him began to distance themselves, fearing association with corruption. Within weeks of the verdict, Herr Otto made the decision to leave Mainz. He could not rebuild his reputation in the city. The taint of suspicion and dishonor would follow him for the remainder of his life if he remained. He departed with what remained of his resources and established himself in another city, where his connection to the trial was less immediate, and where he might begin again with a partial clean slate. His departure created a kind of closure for Margarethe. The man whose mother she had known and respected, who had possibly participated in his mother's murder, was gone from the city. She would not encounter him in the streets or in the marketplace. The immediate conflict that had animated the investigation was resolved. Yet other complications arose. The widows and families of men who had been convicted began, gradually, to approach Margarethe with a particular kind of resentment. These were women and children who had depended on the wealth that had been seized and confiscated. Their husbands and fathers, while guilty of fraud, had nonetheless provided for them, and now those provisions were gone. These women bore Margarethe no explicit grudge. She had not testified against their husbands. She had merely preserved documents that their husbands had tried to conceal. Yet there was nonetheless a quality of blame in their interactions with her, a suggestion that if she had simply remained silent, if she had allowed the secret to be kept, their lives would not have been disrupted so severely. Margarethe understood their perspective. She sympathized with their plight, yet she did not regret her cooperation with the investigation. She understood that justice sometimes involves suffering for those connected to the guilty. This did not make the suffering acceptable or good, but it was an inevitable consequence of bringing criminal activity to account. One afternoon, Anna's father appeared at the tavern, and his demeanor was notably different from his previous anxiety and protectiveness. He approached Margarethe with a formal courtesy that suggested he had come to express something important. "I have been unjust to you," Friedrich said without preamble. "I was frightened for my daughter, and my fear made me suspicious. I believed that your involvement in the investigation might endanger her. But I have come to understand that your integrity, while it does carry risks, is also a form of protection. Those who are honest cannot be easily manipulated or coerced. You have shown my daughter an example of how to live according to principle rather than according to fear. This is valuable beyond measure." He paused, and Margarethe could see emotion moving behind his careful demeanor. "I am grateful for this," he continued. "I am grateful that you did not hide from the truth, and that in refusing to hide, you did not hide my daughter either. She is safer and better for having known you." This reconciliation with Friedrich moved Margarethe more than she would have anticipated. It suggested that her choice to cooperate with the investigation, while it had created complexity and danger, had also yielded something positive, a demonstration that integrity could be maintained even under pressure, and that such maintenance had value. The relationship between Margarethe and Anna deepened in the aftermath of the trial. What had been a relationship based on employment and mutual respect became something more substantive, a genuine partnership in the running of the tavern and in the conduct of life itself. Anna began to be more than an employee. She became, in effect, Margarethe's partner in the business. They made decisions together, managed the finances jointly, and gradually moved toward a more formal arrangement where Anna held a genuine stake in the tavern's operation and profits. The city began to settle into a new configuration in the months following the trial. The fraud schemes that had been exposed were not the only corruptions that existed in Mainz's commercial world. They were never the only corruptions, but their exposure and the punishment of those responsible created a chilling effect. Merchants became more cautious. They were less willing to engage in obviously fraudulent practices. The threat of investigation and prosecution, demonstrated by what had occurred with Burkhardt and his associates, made the risks of blatant corruption seem higher than before. Margarethe's tavern underwent a subtle transformation during this period. It remained a place of commerce and conversation, of beer and bread, of ordinary life. But it also became, in a more formal sense, a place where disputes were settled, where negotiations occurred between people who might otherwise not meet, where the magistrates' representatives would occasionally consult with Margarethe about matters of commerce and business conflict. Her reputation for integrity and her demonstrated ability to maintain confidentiality while also serving justice made her a resource for people attempting to resolve disputes fairly or to understand the landscape of commerce in the city. Yet Margarethe did not actively seek this role. She did not transform herself into some kind of formal arbiter or mediator. Rather, she simply remained herself, honest, observant, willing to listen and to think carefully about what she heard. People came to her because they recognized these qualities in her, and they valued her perspective. Several months after the trial, Magistrate von Bruck visited the tavern privately, requesting a private conversation. They sat in the small room where Margarethe conducted her private business, and von Bruck came directly to the purpose of his visit. "The Prince Archbishop is impressed with the resolution of the case," von Bruck said. "My superiors view the investigation as successful and as a demonstration of effective administration of justice. I have been offered a position in the regional authority, overseeing investigations in multiple cities. It is an advancement that I am inclined to accept." Margarethe listened without interrupting, sensing that there was more to come. "I am telling you this because I wish you to understand that your cooperation with the investigation has had consequences beyond the immediate case," von Bruck continued. "It has established a pattern and a precedent. It has demonstrated that an investigation conducted with care and integrity can succeed. It has shown that cooperation from unexpected sources, from people outside the formal structures of power, can be valuable. I believe that my advancement in position is, in part, a consequence of this investigation's success. And that success was, in part, dependent on your willingness to reveal what you knew." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I wish to offer you something," he said finally. "Not a position, for I understand that you are not interested in formal employment, but an arrangement. Should you ever encounter information that you believe is evidence of crime or serious wrongdoing, I wish to be your direct contact, not intermediaries, not formal channels, directly to me, at my discretion regarding whether to pursue investigation. In exchange, I would ensure that your role in any resulting investigation remains as discreet as circumstances permit, and that you are protected from retaliation to the extent that my authority and resources allow." Margarethe considered this offer carefully. She understood what von Bruck was proposing, a kind of alliance, an unofficial relationship whereby she would become, in effect, his informant and source of information about the city's various affairs. It was tempting, in some ways. It offered her protection and suggested that she could continue to serve justice while remaining relatively inconspicuous. Yet it also threatened the independence and the neutrality that she had worked so carefully to maintain. "I am grateful for the offer," she said finally, "and I acknowledge your competence and your integrity as a magistrate, but I must decline. I cannot become officially or unofficially aligned with any authority, even a just one. If I do so, I lose my independence and my neutrality. People will no longer trust me to be their own person. They will trust me only as an extension of whatever authority I am aligned with. That trust is more valuable to me than protection or advantage." Von Bruck seemed to have expected this response. He smiled slightly. "I thought you might decline," he said. "I respect that decision. I made the offer because I believe you are capable of contributing significantly to justice in this city. But I understand that you believe your contribution is most valuable when you maintain your independence. That is a legitimate perspective." He stood to depart and then paused.
"I will say this," he added. "If you ever change your mind, if you ever wish to formalize our relationship, the offer remains open. And if you find yourself in genuine danger, if circumstances become truly threatening, I wish you to contact me directly. The protection of someone of your integrity seems to me to be a reasonable use of my authority." After von Bruck departed, Margarethe sat alone in the small room for a long time, reflecting on the consequences of the choices she had made. She had revealed the box and its contents. She had cooperated with the investigation. She had, in effect, participated in bringing about the punishment of people who had committed serious crimes. This had been the right choice, she believed, but it was also a choice that had altered the trajectory of her life in ways that were still unfolding. The trial had ended. The verdicts had been rendered, and the guilty had been punished. Yet the investigation into Donna Elisabetta's death and the fraud schemes had not truly ended. It had simply transformed into something else. The knowledge that such crimes had occurred, that they had been discovered and prosecuted, that someone of integrity had been willing to risk her own position to see justice done. This knowledge would ripple through the city for years, altering how people calculated risk and reward, how they assessed the likelihood of detection and punishment, how they thought about the consequences of their actions. And Margarethe found herself transformed as well. She was no longer simply a tavern keeper of modest means who had managed to build an independent business. She was a woman who had encountered serious crime and had chosen integrity over safety. She was a woman who had faced dangerous knowledge and had not looked away from it. She was a woman of principle, and that principle, while it had brought her neither wealth nor formal power, had brought her something she valued more: the knowledge that she was capable of standing for truth and justice, even when doing so was difficult and costly. Several years had passed since the trial concluded, and the city had settled into a new rhythm, different from what had come before, but not dramatically so. The great upheavals of the investigation and prosecution had faded into history, still remembered, certainly, still referenced in conversations about justice and corruption, but no longer the urgent preoccupation of daily life. Commerce continued. The seasons turned. People were born and died, and conducted their small dramas of ambition, conflict, and cooperation. Margarethe was approaching 40 years of age now, though she had stopped marking her years with particular attention. Her face showed the marks of time and labor, lines around her eyes, a deepening of the planes of her cheeks, a quality of weariness that came from decades of early rising and continuous work. Yet her body remained strong, and her mind remained sharp. She moved through her tavern with the authority of long possession and deep knowledge. Every corner of the space, every object, every relationship was known to her with the intimacy of someone who had created something and maintained it over years of careful attention. The tavern itself had evolved incrementally, almost without Margarethe's conscious direction. The bar had been replaced with a finer wood. The cellar had been expanded further and reinforced with better construction. The kitchen had been enlarged and equipped with better tools and equipment. A second room had been added, creating a more formal space for private conversations and business negotiations. The establishment was no longer modest precisely, but it remained unpretentious. It was prosperous without being ostentatious, respected without being pretentious. Anna had become over the years increasingly essential to the tavern's operation. She was now a woman of perhaps 30 years, intelligent, skilled, and possessed of a quiet authority that matched Margarethe's own. The two women had developed a partnership that resembled, in many ways, a marriage of equals. They made decisions together, trusted each other's judgment, and had woven their lives together in ways that transcended the simple relationship between employer and employee. The tavern was as much Anna's as it was Margarethe's, though this ownership was never formally documented. It existed in the quality of their collaboration and in the mutual understanding that they had built over years of working together. Margarethe had trained other women as well, younger women who came to the tavern seeking work, and who found in her a model of how to conduct oneself with integrity and competence in a world that offered limited opportunities to their gender. Some of these women moved on to other employment, or to marriages that took them away from Mainz. Others remained, becoming trusted members of the tavern's permanent staff. Several had been placed, through Margarethe's recommendations and connections, in positions in other establishments, managing households, running smaller taverns or shops, working as companions or assistants to other women of standing. Katharina continued to visit the tavern regularly, though her circumstances had changed. Her marriage as a widow had ended in modest contentment rather than joy. She had never remarried after her first husband's death, choosing instead to establish herself as an independent woman of means. She had become involved in various philanthropic activities, working with the church to provide assistance to widows and orphaned children. Her life had in many ways become more satisfying than it had been when she was married. She had autonomy, purpose, and the respect of people who valued her work. One afternoon in late autumn, Katharina and Margarethe sat together in the tavern after the lunch customers had departed. They had not seen each other for several weeks, as Katharina had been occupied with a project involving the establishment of a small school for girls whose families could not afford to educate them. Katharina was excited about the progress of the work and wanted to share news of it with Margarethe. "I have been thinking about something," Katharina said, after they had discussed her philanthropic activities. "About what you did years ago. About the box and the investigation and the trial. People still speak of it, you know. Not constantly, not in the way they speak of it immediately after it occurred, but it remains a reference point. People speak of it as an example of integrity, of someone who possessed dangerous knowledge and who chose truth over safety." "I did what seemed necessary at the time," Margarethe said simply. "I'm not certain I would do the same thing again, if I could return to that moment. But I cannot return, so the question is somewhat theoretical." "Would you truly not do the same thing?" Katharina asked. "Even knowing the consequences?" Margarethe was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I would do the same thing," she said finally. "But I would do it more reluctantly, with more awareness of the cost. When I revealed the box, I was still young enough to believe that truth serves justice relatively simply. I understand now that truth can be complicated, that revealing it can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate guilty parties, that the pursuit of justice can harm innocent people. Yet these complications do not change the fundamental principle, that concealing evidence of serious wrongdoing is not an acceptable way to avoid complication." She paused and then added, "The investigation did punish guilty people, but it also harmed families that depended on wealth acquired through crime. That was not pleasant to observe, but it was not unjust either. The just order of things sometimes requires disruption and suffering on the part of people connected to the guilty. I have made my peace with this understanding." The conversation turned to other matters, but it lingered in Margarethe's mind long after Katharina had departed. The question of whether she had done the right thing had ceased many years ago to be a question that troubled her.
She had acted according to her values and according to her understanding of what was just and right. The consequences had flowed from that action, and she had adapted to those consequences. But the question of whether she would do the same thing again, if she could, this was a question that seemed to get at something deeper, something about who she was and what she valued. She realized, in reflecting on her answer, that she would indeed do the same thing. The cost had been real, but the cost of not doing so would have been greater. The cost would have been the knowledge that she had abandoned someone she cared for, that she had allowed criminals to escape justice, that she had chosen her own comfort over her principles. This cost would have been unbearable. Yet there was also a different kind of reflection that occupied her thoughts during these years. She found herself thinking more frequently about her father, about the failures that had defined his life, about the lessons she had learned from observing his mistakes. She had avoided his particular errors. She had not trusted too easily. She had not been too naive about human nature. But she wondered sometimes whether in avoiding his mistakes, she had also become in some ways diminished. Her caution and her careful observation of others had served her well, but they had also kept her somewhat distant from people, somewhat removed from the full experience of connection and vulnerability that characterizes intimate human relationships. She thought about this, and she realized that she had found a kind of answer to it through Anna and through the other people who worked with her. She had allowed herself to trust Anna, had made herself vulnerable to Anna's presence in her life, and this trust had not been betrayed. She had learned to distinguish between the kind of naive trust that her father had extended to people who did not deserve it, and the kind of careful, earned trust that could be extended to people who had demonstrated their integrity through their actions over time. This kind of trust that was earned and maintained, was both safer and more meaningful than her father's approach had been. One evening in winter, as snow began to fall, and the city took on the muffled quality that snow creates, Margarethe sat alone in her tavern after the last customers had departed. She had sent Anna and the other staff members to rest, and she occupied herself with the closing routines, ensuring that the fire was banked safely, that the doors were locked, that all the objects that constituted her material world were in their proper places. She found herself descending to the cellar, a place she visited now only occasionally, out of habit and memory, rather than necessity. The stone where the box had been hidden was no longer loose. After the box had been removed and delivered to the magistrate, she had had the stone properly secured. There was no indication now that anything had ever been hidden there. She stood in the cellar for a long time, in the darkness, and thought about Donna Elisabetta. The widow had been dead for more than a decade now, her murder long since prosecuted and avenged in the only ways that human justice could manage. Yet she remained present, in a sense, in the knowledge that her documents had served the cause of truth and justice. The widow had taken great care to preserve evidence of wrongdoing. Not for her own benefit, she would not live to see the investigation and trial, but to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge. This act of faith, Donna Elisabetta's belief that she could preserve knowledge that would eventually be discovered and acted upon, seemed to Margarethe to be a kind of wisdom that transcended the ordinary self-interest that motivated most people. The widow had understood that she might not live to see justice done, but she had trusted that if she preserved the evidence carefully, justice might eventually occur. She had placed her faith not in any particular person or institution,
but in the possibility that truth, if carefully preserved, would eventually have power. Margarethe had been the vessel through which that faith had been rewarded. She had kept the secret safe. She had preserved the box without opening it, without violating the trust that had been extended to her. And when the moment came when revealing the secret would serve justice, she had revealed it.
In this way, she had honored not just Donna Elisabetta's explicit instructions to keep the box safe, but also the deeper intention behind those instructions, the widow's desire that the truth be known and that justice be served. This understanding, which had come to Margarethe only gradually over years of reflection, seemed to her now to be the most important lesson she had learned from the entire experience. It was not the lesson about integrity or about the consequences of telling the truth. Rather, it was a lesson about the way that truth operates in human affairs, about how secrets can be preserved not as ends in themselves, but as means to larger purposes, about how trust can be honored even when the letter of a trust is technically violated in service to its spirit. Time passed, as it always does. The seasons continued their rotation. Margarethe continued her work. She grew older, accumulating years and experience in the way that people do. Her hands became more marked by age. Her hair became entirely gray. Her body slowed incrementally. Yet the tavern continued, and with it, her purpose and her meaning. She thought sometimes about what would happen after her death, about whether the tavern would continue to exist, and if so, in what form. Anna was capable of managing it, and Anna would likely do so. The question was whether Anna would wish to, whether the tavern would remain Anna's primary occupation, or whether other possibilities might emerge. Margarethe did not attempt to control these future possibilities. She had learned through her life that attempting to control the future was largely futile. What mattered was to tend carefully to the present, to make good decisions with the information one had, to act with integrity and thought. The future would unfold as it would. One evening, near the end of winter, Margarethe received a visit from a traveling monk, a different man than the one who had visited during the time of the investigation, but of a similar character. This monk had come to Mainz seeking shelter and sustenance, and he had been directed to Margarethe's tavern by someone who knew its reputation for offering hospitality to travelers. The monk was perhaps 50 years old, with a face marked by years of travel and exposure to sun and weather. He carried with him a small pack containing his personal possessions and a staff for walking. He was learned and thoughtful, and he spent several evenings in the tavern, conversing with Margarethe and with other patrons about matters of philosophy and theology, and the nature of human suffering and redemption. On his final evening before departing, he and Margarethe sat together, and he spoke to her directly about what he sensed in her character and her life. "You are a woman of integrity," he said. "This is visible in the way you conduct your business, in the way people respond to you, in the quality of attention you give to those around you. Yet I sense also that you have been tested by life in significant ways. There is a depth to you that comes from having faced consequences and having chosen to accept them rather than to avoid them." Margarethe was not entirely comfortable with being observed so directly, yet she sensed that the monk meant no harm, and that his observations came from genuine perception rather than presumption. "I have made choices," she said simply. "Some of them were good choices, I believe. Others were more complicated." "All choices are complicated," the monk said.
That is the nature of human existence. We live in a world of genuine moral complexity, where the right course of action is often unclear, where honoring one value requires sacrificing another, where doing what is just may involve suffering for people who do not deserve to suffer. This is not the fault of any individual person. It is the fundamental condition of being alive in a fallen world. He was quiet for a moment, and then he continued, "What matters, I believe, is not that we make perfect choices. Perfect choices are impossible. What matters is that we choose with care and reflection, that we attempt to honor multiple values even when they conflict, that we take responsibility for the consequences of our choices rather than attempting to escape them. In this you have done well." He blessed her before he departed, a simple blessing, spoken in Latin, the words of which Margarethe did not understand, but whose meaning she grasped nonetheless. It was a blessing offered by one person of faith to another, acknowledging the difficulty of the path and wishing peace upon it. After the monk had departed, Margarethe found herself in a reflective mood. She sat in her tavern in the early evening, when the light was beginning to fade, and when the customers were only beginning to arrive. She watched as people entered, familiar faces mostly, people she had known for years or decades. She watched them settle into their usual places, begin their usual conversations, order their usual drinks. This was her world, this tavern, these people, these routines. They constituted the substance of her life. She had not become wealthy beyond measure, or famous or powerful in any conventional sense, yet she had created something that mattered. She had created a space where people could come and be themselves, where they were treated with fairness and respect, where they could be heard and understood. She had created a business that had supported her independence and the independence of others. She had conducted herself with integrity, and this integrity had been tested and had held. The future stretched ahead. Probably not a long future at her age, but a future nonetheless. Years would pass, changes would come, she would age further. Eventually she would die, and the tavern would pass to others, and those others would change it in ways she could not predict or control. But for now, in this moment, she sat in her establishment and felt a sense of rightness about the life she had lived, about the choices she had made, about the person she had become. Outside the tavern, the city continued its endless commerce. Merchants negotiated prices. Craftspeople plied their trades. The great structures of power and authority continued to function, or to attempt to function, or to stumble forward in their imperfect ways. Above it all, the cathedral bells marked the hours, and people were born and lived and died. Margarethe rose from her chair and moved back to the bar, where Anna was preparing drinks for the customers who were settling in for the evening. She placed her hand briefly on Anna's shoulder, a gesture of affection and solidarity, a confirmation of the partnership they had built over years of working together. "The fire in the back room is burning well," she said. "We should be comfortable tonight, even as the cold deepens." Anna smiled at her, and Margarethe felt, as she often did in moments like this, a sense of peace. Not the peace of certainty or of completion, those were illusions, she understood now. Rather, the peace of having done the work before her, of having honored her commitments, of having lived according to her values as faithfully as she could manage. The peace of knowing that whatever came next, she had been true to herself and true to those she cared for. The tavern filled with people as the evening progressed. Voices rose and fell in conversation. The scent of beer and bread and humanity filled the air. The fire crackled in its hearth. And Margarethe moved through it all with the quiet authority that comes from knowing one's place and having earned it through years of careful work and integrity. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. For now, there was only this moment, this place, this life she had built with her own hands and her own choices. It was enough. It was, perhaps, everything that mattered.